Hello and welcome to the sixth session of the Economic Histories of the Global South seminar series. This series is organized by me, Zain Al-Qazi, and my colleague, Sonal Raghuvanshi. The series, which has been running from the beginning of the year, brings together social scientists engaged in economic history from different parts of the globe to build a comparative understanding of the historical development of the Global South. Earlier sessions have looked at the political worlds of South Asian sailors, the long history of the Punjab peasantry, the lives of Mozambican workers, the historical impact of labor saving machinery on Indian labor, and the political economy of cotton production in Egypt. Today, we discuss Teemu Ruskola's recent article in the New Left Review, The Making of the Chinese Working Class, which summarizes arguments from his book, The Unmaking of the Chinese Working Class, which will be published by Verso next year. Our discussants are Chitra Joshi and Jonathan Hyslop. Before we get into the session, a note regarding the format. Teemu will speak to us for 40 minutes about his article, after which Chitra and John will have 20 minutes each for their interventions. Teemu will return for 10 minutes to address their comments, after which we will put your questions from the audience to all three speakers. So you can register your question at any time during today's seminar by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let me begin by introducing Teemu Ruskola. Teemu Ruskola is a professor of law and professor of East Asian languages at the University of Pennsylvania. He works on comparative law and social theory, often with China as a vantage point. His books include Legal Orientalism, China, the United States, and Modern Law, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2013, and The Unmaking of the Chinese Working Class, forthcoming by Verso Books this spring. An advanced excerpt of the book was published in the New Left Review earlier this year. So, Teemu, you have 40 minutes. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Zain and Sonal, and all of you for organizing this. And as also for the distinguished commentators for being here, and of course for the audience for being here, whatever here means, in the cyberspace wherever you are. And as Zain said, this is indeed a part of a book project, which is coming out in the spring, and the title of the book and the article is obviously an homage to E.P. Thompson's Social History, The Making of the English Working Class, which was the paradigmatic proletariat in the initial stages of industrial capitalism in the West. And therefore, I think it is the perfect counterpoint to think about the Chinese working class, which is another proletariat of global significance on the opposite edge of the Eurasian landmass, at a critical point in the unfolding of late-stage capitalism. And I will say, because the project is comparative, it is especially exciting to be in India, as it were, today, and to be hearing from my comparisons are predominantly north-south for reasons I will explain shortly, but the south-south element, I think, will add an important element to the conversation. So let me preface myself just a little bit to say that this project, it is aimed for a wider non-academic audience, optimistically perhaps. But when I'm thinking of this project really as a kind of extended interpretive essay that offers an analytic framework and a structural account of a very complicated history. And ultimately, my hope is to make a theoretical and comparative contribution. So hence this venue is really ideal. And to make my account manageable, this is a huge topic. I focus primarily on two things, the changing organization of land and labor in China, which are often known sort of telegraphically as the land question and the peasant question. And it's that what brings me to Thompson, really. His book focuses primarily on the late 18th, early 19th centuries, kind of the subjective formation of the English working class, but he does frame his analysis in terms of the earlier enclosure movement, which, as we all know, expropriated peasants of their land and left them with no option but to sell their labor. So basically in England, the commodification of land was followed by the commodification of labor. Because until the early 16th century or so, English farming, of course, was conducted largely in manorial estates that were organized as common fields. But then, as markets began to emerge for agricultural products, lords began to enclose lands that were held in common through both legal and extra-legal means. And then this ultimately marked a transition from feudalism to agrarian capitalism, from cultivation for subsistence to commercial agriculture. And these enclosures ultimately transformed overlapping feudal tenures, very complicated system, into exclusive forms of modern property, which the owner can alienate at will. And these enclosures over time became a source of capital that could be invested. First in textile mills in the countryside, soon in other forms of rural, as well as finally urban industry. And once the commons were enclosed and the occupants were expelled, indeed, they had nothing left to sell but their labor, and they became thus the original English working class that Thompson describes. For Marx, famously, the enclosure movement was the paradigmatic example of what he called primitive accumulation, the kind of act of dispossession that jump-starts the system, as it were. Marx called it the original system of capitalism, basically a pre-capitalist method of accumulation that lays the foundation for subsequent capitalist accumulation. Well, significantly, there is in China today occurring a rural dispossession that is sometimes, at least journalistically, referred to as a new enclosure movement. However, there are important differences. In England, the commodification of land and labor took place over several hundred years. In China, these processes are being telescoped into a few decades, and they are taking place in the opposite order. When industrial labor was commodified in China in the 1990s, there was an endless stream of migrant laborers into cities, even without a large-scale commodification of rural land or expropriation of rural land. So why then, this is sort of one of the key animated questions in my book, why then dispossess a peasantry that has already submitted to capital voluntarily? That is to say, under economic duress, without the need to resort to forcible dislocation. Well, to answer that question, I start with the premise that there has never been a single People's Republic of China. Marx believed that socialism would abolish the distinction between city and country. Yet there have always been at least two unequal Chinese republics, an urban and a rural one. Because ever since agriculture was collectivized after land reform, every piece of land and every human being in China had been categorized legally and administratively as either rural or urban. That's because, unlike its socialist peers, China has never nationalized the ownership of all land. Even today, it distinguishes between two different forms of public ownership. There's urban land that is owned by the state, and then there is rural land that's owned by the collectives that cultivate it. And because Chinese collectives are indeed at least formally separate from the state sector, they have, throughout the People's Republic, they have enjoyed at least a degree of autonomy. Well, at the same time, that autonomy has also made it possible, or this way to organize the land has also made it possible for China's industrial economy to exploit them in distinctive ways. And specifically, and this really is the key, it's not just that the peasants in China didn't have to be expropriated in order to exploit it. It's precisely their continuing entitlement to land that has been the means by which they have been exploited, first under state socialism and then under state capitalism. And here, let me come back a little bit to the global and comparative aspects of this project. So I definitely don't want to tell another story about capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? Uh, Nothing wrong with that story, but I take it as a given that capitalism is always vernacularized in specific ways everywhere. Important, but that's really not what I'm focusing on. That story has been told by many very well. I want to really focus on talking about capitalism or tell a story about capitalism with global characteristics here. And secondly, my framing is indeed explicitly comparative. My two main references are England and the Soviet Union to a lesser degree. And I've chosen those references for two reasons. I'm interested in using Marx to rethink China and China to rethink Marx. So for Marx, the enclosure movement is the paradigmatic transition from feudalism to capitalism, as I said. And of course, after the Cold War, the Soviet Union has come to be seen as the paradigmatic transition from socialism to capitalism, sort of history going backward. And China, as it turns out, does not conform to either teleology. So I'm interested in thinking about exactly how and why. And finally, this project is in some ways kind of old school, in the sense that it is a return, you might say, to a kind of grand, big picture comparative history that was probably last in vogue in the mid 20th century. But I think today, I would say, we live in a era, I would say, of microhistories, which tend to focus on the local and the particular. And I think that's really important. We have gained deep kind of vertical knowledge. But what I worry is that with this increasing specialization, the emergence of subdisciplines, subdisciplines, it is becoming harder to make connections across disciplines, across space, across time. Um, and as you may have noticed, I don't have any slides, but I do have one handout, which is basically, it just gives you the table of contents for the book, which serves as the roadmap for my comments. And let me see if I know how to drop it into the chat. Looks like it worked. And then also, by way of terminology, there are sort of, I talk about state-owned enterprises a lot, so I refer to them by as SOEs, which is a common shorthand. I will also be referring to township and village enterprises, which is a lesser known term, so I will be referring to them as TVEs. So the handout just, has those terms there. So let me start with the socialist foundations. Uh, the PRC was established in 1949. The first thing it did in 1950 was to enact a land reform law in order to transform the country's quote-unquote feudal economic structure. So at first, peasants became owners of individual plots of land, which was not a revolutionary transformation. In many ways, this was actually a return to a traditional practice of smallholding owners. Many Chinese dynasties started their reigns by redistributing land. So the idea of equalizing ownership was not new. You can trace it all the way back to, their so-called well-field system in the Zhou dynasty in the classical period. There was another system called equal field system in the Tang dynasty in the 8th century, so on and so on. What was ultimately radical was the consolidation of ownership in the mid-50s. The land that had originally been given to households individually was then collectivized. But, as I suggested, in a major ideological concession to peasants, collectives were given ownership of the land that they cultivated. And this distinction between the ownership between urban versus rural land is one that has no precedent either in Chinese history or Marxist thought or Soviet practice, for example. And conveniently, this also became a justification for making these new rural communes self-dependent and ultimately responsible for their own welfare needs, which meant that they could be subject even to famine without the intervention from the central government. Well, this is, of course, also the beginning of the Cold War. So to keep up with the Cold War, China immediately began developing an indigenous heavy industry as well. It had almost no access to external capital, some Soviet aid, especially after the Korean War. But basically, China began extracting resources from the countryside to set up elite production units in the cities. And here, China was basically following the Soviet model. In the 20s, the Soviet Bolshevik economist Yevgeny Preobrazhensky had theorized the idea of primitive socialist accumulation as the socialist version of laying down an industrial foundation. And these production units in the cities were structured as SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Unlike peasants, these SOE workers enjoyed cradle-to-grave welfare, funded by resources drawn from the countryside. They had lifelong job security as well as free housing, schools, hospital, cultural facilities, so on, the so-called iron rice bowl, right? And the work unit had all these services in one place. So these were really kind of total institutions in a sociological sense. Well, in my nomenclature, this was the original making of the Chinese working class, with an important twist, right? The English working class was notoriously a subordinated industrial proletariat. In contrast, these SOE workers in China were a privileged class, at least in relative terms. They were a kind of socialist labor aristocracy. Well, if rural resources kept flowing to the cities, what exactly kept the peasants in their place, literally in the countryside? This was done through the so-called hukou, or household registration system. It tied key benefits to a person's residence, ranging from everything such as housing to schooling to food rations. The crucial point then is that in the Maoist era, the term peasant, numin, was not just a social identity or an ideological label. It was also, and perhaps above all, a legal status conferred by the government administratively. The revolution, therefore, did not just recognize peasants and workers as the two leading classes of the nation. It made them, and it assigned them spatial and administrative coordinates. So peasants were tied to the country and to the rural land their collectives owned. Workers, in the technical socialist sense, were attached to their urban work units owned by the state. And moreover, because it was nearly impossible to change your hukou, which was passed down intergenerationally, because of this, rural poverty ultimately turned into an inherited, perhaps caste-like condition. In any event, to return to my comparative point, in England, peasants had to be expropriated to get them to take on wage labor. First, as I said, as agricultural laborers involved in commercial farming, then first in rural industries, textile mills, and finally in cities with the emergence of England's infamous industrial factories. So, in other words, in England, industrialization transformed a feudal peasantry into smallholding farmers and or expropriated them from the commons altogether. Well, in China, the revolution took a population of smallholders and it feudalized them by tying them to collectively held land, a kind of socialist commons, the very opposite of what happened in England. So, what do we make of this new rural versus Chinese distinction? Well, for one thing, it was not a vestige of feudalism that somehow persisted into socialism. In the reigning Confucian ideology, farmers had been glorified. They stood above merchants and other urbanites who were seen as counterproductive. Of course, there were a large number of poor farmers, their ideological glorification aside, and they are often described as permanent tenants in the historical literature. However, contrary to Marxist historiography, these permanent tenants did not exist in a state of feudal bondage. A permanent tenant owned his use right, and they could lease it, they could sell it, they could mortgage it. The distinction was that the landlord owned the subsoil, whereas the tenant owned the topsoil, the right to cultivate, and like I said, that was alienable, sellable, that they owned it. Yes, the tenants were often miserably poor, but they were very much oppressed by market forces, not by feudal lords. So in short, even though early modern China was far more urbanized than Europe, urban citizens in China enjoyed no privileges vis-a-vis the country, in contrast to Europe, where cities were legally exempt from feudal obligations. Famously in Europe, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free, right? So the point here being, the legally enforced rural-urban distinction in China really is a socialist contribution. Well, in any event, over the long run, this regime of primitive socialist accumulation, as I described it, kept the countryside poor. So when China's economic reforms began in 1978, the main priority was reducing rural poverty. The first reform was, as those of us who are old enough to remember, was the de-collectivization of agriculture, which was known as the household responsibility system. Basically, collectives were allowed to assign individual plots to their members, which ultimately led to an increase in agricultural production. But because of these mobility controls that were still in place, This more efficient farming also resulted in a massive surplus of labor in the countryside. But because peasants were also increasingly allowed to sell what they produced, their new savings also became a source of capital, which became invested in rural industry, which ultimately absorbed much, if not most, of the surplus labor. And this is the rise of the so-called township and village enterprises, TVEs. They were hugely successful, and most people have already forgotten this. But the first 2 decades of the Chinese economic miracle were driven by rural industry. All the gleaming towers of Shanghai that you see in the news were beyond anyone's contemplation. That area was literally rice fields where you see those towers. That area was literally rice fields into the 90s. Just one statistic. In 15 years, these TVE's share of China's total output went from 9% to 36%, more than a third of China's GDP, when China's economy as a whole was also exploding at a world historic rate. And this is important. Looking back, a lot of people tell a kind of teleological story about rural industry as if the spirit of capitalism had just been waiting to erupt out of the Chinese soil. Well, agriculture was partly decollectivized, but paradoxically, it gave rise to collectivized industry. What had been a socialist agricultural commons was simply transformed into a socialist industrial commons, as it were. So again, from a comparative point, in England, too, rural industry emerged early on. But again, in China, when this rural industry emerged, there was no dispossession. Precisely because these villagers, they owned the land, they owned the capital, they didn't have to dispossess themselves. So basically, I argue that the early success of rural industry ought to be viewed as a uniquely Chinese socialist development or experiment based on a form of a local public enterprise. Well, in the meantime, though, these SOEs in the cities continued to stagnate while the countryside was booming. And in the mid-1990s, the state switched course. It began to crack down on this rural industry, and it started to direct both rural and global capital to cities in order to help revive these SOEs. And this then inaugurated an entirely new regime of technocratic state capitalism premised on urban development. And that is the China you see splash across global media today, mega cities with stunning skylines. So let me then turn from this rural industry to urban reforms. I'm not going to go, there were a lot of different unsuccessful efforts to revive the state sector, but ultimately the state decided to restructure both capital and labor. Capital was reorganized with the aid of the People's Republic's first ever company law, which came into force in 1994. A lot of people assume the purpose was to privatize the state enterprises, but the actual goal was to corporatize them, which is to say, to convert them into the legal form of a shareholding corporation, which allowed the state to draw in outside capital, rural, foreign, global capital, in order to revive these enterprises. But at the same time, the state was designed to remain the controlling shareholder. So in many ways, this changed primarily the form in which state exercises its control over capital. But it did utterly revolutionize the state's relationship to labor, because in 1994, China enacted a new labor law as well. And that law required for the first time that all employees must be put on contracts. And legally, to me, this marks the unmaking of the Chinese working class. Unlike peasants, workers had no land to expropriate. The land was owned by the state. Instead, they were dispossessed of their chief socialist entitlement, the iron rice bowl, or the right to employment. So with the institution of the employment contract, the ideological unity of capital and labor was broken. Industrial labor was commodified in essentially one generation, which is staggering. The collective subject, formerly known as the people, was atomized into independent economic subjects who consent to their conditions of employment, and they remained responsible for their own welfare outside of work. Consequently, these SOEs were transformed into corporations whose goal was to deliver profits, not social welfare. Over time, this did lead to mass layoffs, especially when eventually small to medium SOEs were privatized in the 1990s, late 1990s, and early 2000s. Well, what is more, this restructuring of work also resulted in tectonic shifts in the boundaries among the state, the market, and the family. As I suggested, a classic SOE work unit, which was organized as a single physical unit, it took care of its workers from birth to death. It was basically the state, enterprise, and family rolled into one. When it was reimagined as a business corporation, the state had to find new ways to deliver the same benefits. And there have been basically three solutions. The state has continued to deliver some benefits directly through other state institutions, primary education, perhaps most importantly. Numerous other welfare functions have been privatized to the family. Think childcare, think elder care. And that's actually also reflected in many aspects of family law, law of succession, so on and so on. And of course, lots and lots of other things are now provided through the market. For example, housing and healthcare, and basically everything else that is not either directly still provided by the state or privatized to the family. So together, the promotion of private enterprise, which was also going on, and the replacement of the work unit housing entailed the commodification of urban land, which then has given rise to the real estate bubble that today threatens China's economy as a whole. So here we have the foundation for the regime of state capitalism that drives urban China, which is the perfect marriage of global capital and cheap labor. So here, let me turn to migrant labor and say more about cheap labor. So the hukou system was still in place, the household registration system. However, now many work units, as I said, were available on the market, housing most importantly. This meant that peasants now could move to cities. To be sure, they still remained second-class citizens. They didn't have the access to the full menu of urban privileges, for example, schooling for their kids, but at least they could choose between urban poverty and rural poverty. This new potential for mobility coincided with a growing urban need for workers. So the state no longer had to rely on extracting a rural surplus through a previous system. The state now had access to money through global capital markets. But now what the urban industry needed was labor, which also coincided with rising unemployment in the countryside as the state was cracking down on rural industry. So it was peasants who turned into an army of migrant labor in the cities. So the term migrant labor, in Chinese, the Chinese term is nongminggong. It means literally peasant worker. Well, in the administrative logic of state socialism, that is a contradiction in terms. Someone who, legally speaking, should not exist. Peasants, as I said, are supposed to be peasants farming in the land, collectively owned land in the countryside, while workers work in urban industry. So there is no coherent structural or legal position for a person who is both. So from that perspective, the migrant worker who shuttles back and forth between village and city is indeed a hybrid. And in the process, the earlier Maoist class discourse has been replaced by a new rhetoric of so-called suzhi, which basically refers to a person's quality, kind of moral developmental capacity for self-improvement, as it were. And that discourse is highly anti-rural. Peasants are low quality, urbanites are high quality. So within this discourse, peasant worker is like a centaur, as it were, half human, half less than human. Well, in large terms, this is similar to what happened in England. In both places, peasants became what Marx called a reserve army of labor for industrial capital. But again, in China, the commodification of industrial labor took place in industrial workplaces without a large-scale expropriation of the peasantry, which does not gather force until later. precisely because these peasants became a migrant labor force. They did not join the urban proletariat permanently. They shuttled back and forth between their factories and their villages. Their entitlement to land at home is, in effect, their social security. When they lose their jobs, when they don't get paid, when they suffer injuries, they continue to rely on their household plots, at least for subsistence. And this has been important for at least two structural reasons. First of all, it has allowed China to manage several decades of intensive development without large-scale urbanization. One of the original goals of the hukou system was precisely to prevent the emergence of permanent slums in major cities, unlike in many, if not most, developing countries. Today, as we know, migrant workers in these huge factories, they are warehoused in giant dormitories, which are basically corporate labor camps, right? Think Foxconn, think of iPhones and Apple and whatnot. And these are high security facilities with military style labor discipline. They are inhumane, they're dystopian, absolutely. But they are not disorganized slums that threaten public order, right? The workers there are more likely to kill themselves than their bosses. Secondly, these migrant workers are the key to China's cheap, quote unquote, cheap labor. Urban capital is able to pay essentially below subsistence wages because workers are able to continue to rely on their rural households for welfare and social security. Of course, in addition to subsidizing factory wages, the countryside bears also the cost of the reproduction, literal reproduction of urban labor. It continues to bear new cohorts of workers who join the urban workforce. It also cares for them again after they have been used up and they return home. So the crucial analytic point here being, it is uncommodified agricultural rural land and the remains of rural socialism that subsidize China's urban capitalism. So therefore, the question again is not how these migrants have managed to hold on to their land, unlike the early English peasant. It is these workers' continued entitlement to land that makes Chinese state capitalism run. Chinese industrial labor is cheap because of the free labor provided by the peasants left behind in the countryside who support the outgoing migrants. And of course, this is not a subsidy just to the Chinese, or it's not a feature of some especially cruel form of Asian capitalism. It is a structural aspect of global capitalism. It is a subsidy to all the consumers of the world. And here let me quote George Orwell, who said already in 1939, he said, quote, "We forget that the overwhelming bulk of the British proletariat does not live in Britain, but in Asia and Africa," end quote. So, of course, that means that today the Chinese countryside is the world's countryside too. It's also important to connect this emergence of migrant labor with the decline of the state sector. After all the state workers were put on employment contracts, even urban citizens no longer enjoy a guaranteed share of the benefits of economic development. So perversely, the labor law reforms that I talked about have created a new, at least relative equality among workers, not by leveling up the status of the migrant laborer, but by leveling down the status of previously privileged urban worker. So today, what was originally a legally enforced status inequality between peasants and urban workers, that inequality is now being overwhelmed with a simple distinction between the rich and the poor. So the formerly separate social classes now merge in a single race to the bottom. Class is no longer indexed strictly either to geography or to occupation. Instead, we are dealing with class in a purely economic sense. So that's my comparative take on the commodification of land and labor in the urban state sector. But let me focus more on the countryside. So it is important to recognize that, yes, officially all land in China remains publicly owned, either by the state or collectives, and it has to, for ideological reasons. But China has enacted a land administration law and a slew other legislation that recognize the contractual transfer of use right to private parties. So technically, it is only the right to use land that has been commodified rather than land itself. But that is a kind of metaphysical as well as legal fiction. What is ownership of land if not the right to use it and exclude others? And it certainly has not prevented the formation of a very active housing market, as we all know. Even in Hong Kong under British colonialism, all the land was crown land, but it was under long-term crown leases. It could be bought and sold, and Hong Kong was obviously a hyper-capitalist society. As I suggested, urban land was commodified early on when the state workers' housing was dismantled and privatized. Well, today, rural land too is being commodified, which has led to rural land takings on a scale that is unprecedented in human history. And this is a phenomenon that is known as 虚地农民, or land-losing peasants. Well, most people lump all the land-losing peasants into a single category, but it's actually important to distinguish between the early phase and the current one. So the first stage of enclosures in the countryside was driven by the needs of local government financing. As the quality of rural health and services suffered, the state responded by promulgating all kinds of social security legislation. But actually a lot, if not both for rural and urban workers. But most of these new welfare mandates have been unfunded. They have placed the financial burden on local governments. So as their human resources have become increasingly damaged and depleted, localities have turned to their only remaining asset, which is land. So with urban development, the potential market value anywhere near urban areas has skyrocketed. But until recently, rural land that was legally classified as rural could not be used commercially unless and until it was reclassified as urban. So to be sure, the law required that the villagers must be compensated, but that compensation was only for the agricultural value of the land, which is a fraction of its value when it's developed commercially. So if somebody builds a luxury condo on your rice paddy, you're not going to be able to afford to live there. Chitra, did you have a question?
It's by mistake.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to take clarifying.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries. I thought maybe my mic died or something. The point is that this first stage of enclosures for government funding purposes, it basically expanded the urban footprint by incorporating adjacent villages into legally classified urban land, which was actually quite similar in many ways what happened in England too. London is basically a metropolis made up of villages. That's exactly why there's a green and a common every few blocks, marking what was once a village in its own right. But the new, most recent wave of enclosures is qualitatively different. It now seeks to transform rural China itself, not just expand urban China. So this has been a state-managed process with two complementary policies, so-called new land reform and the urbanization of peasants. New land reform is essentially an Orwellian euphemism for reversing the first land reform in 1950. The original one took land from wealthy landowners and gave it to peasants. The new land reform seeks to take peasants' household plots and to consolidate them into large commercial farms owned by agribusiness. And in order to make that possible, even rural land is now being commodified. So members of rural collectives today are legally allowed to sell the right to use their land directly to urban actors, including agribusiness, without needing to reclassify the land as urban first. In theory, this consolidation of agricultural land is supposed to take the form of voluntary market transactions, but in practice, the consolidation often becomes coercive. It is facilitated by local officials. This new land reform is also associated with a new urbanization policy that aims to urbanize the peasants themselves. So when household plots are consolidated, The former occupants are given urban hukou, urban registrations, and they are relocated to cities. So in the process, the last vestiges of rural socialism are now being replaced by agrarian capitalism. So that's kind of the big picture story I want to tell. And I'm going to start wrapping up. But that's we are still left with the question that I started with. In England, the enclosure of the commons was necessary to get the former occupants of the commons to take on wage labor. But in China, as we saw, the peasants took on industrial labor early on without expropriation. When the rural industry first started in the 80s, as I said, there was no need for the peasant to dispossess the peasants because the TVEs were collectives owned by the villagers, so they didn't need to dispossess themselves. But peasants also don't need to be expropriated to get them to work in urban industries because that too has already happened, witness the migrant laborers. So why dispossess the people who have already submitted, as I said, voluntarily to industrial capital? Well, I suggested the reason for the first wave of enclosures. It made money for local governments that needed cash. But it does not explain the second wave and the policy of relocating peasants permanently into cities. The real problem with migrant labor is that it is incompletely proletarianized. So long as China's migrant workers continue to rely on subsistence agriculture, they remain at least partly independent of markets, which means that peasants make first-rate workers, but second-rate consumers. Also, because of their limited access to Social Security, they consume even less, saving every penny that they can. And China's savings rate is world famously, people say it's world historical, right? And of course, those savings then indirectly finance US treasuries and so on and so forth, but that's a different story. But in any event, so far, China has managed this problem of underconsumption through exports, relying on foreign consumers to buy all its stuff, and also by investing massively in infrastructure. But export-led growth has clearly reached or is reaching its limits. Witness all the trade wars. China needs to grow its domestic markets. So the new enclosure movement, in effect, completes the proletarianization of the peasantry. The commodification of land has already turned them into a reserve army of labor. Now, the commodification of rural land turns them into a reserve army of consumers as well. Once they're dispossessed of their land, peasants have no choice but to buy everything they need. They are fully dependent on capital for survival. So that's my local conclusion. Now, let me try to bring this to a comparative and global conclusion as well. So I've emphasized the English case, which, as I said, at least for Marx, is the paradigmatic example of a transition from feudalism to capitalism. That analogy is instructive but incomplete because China, of course, is transitioning from socialism to capitalism. So let me say at least a couple of words about the Soviet Union as the paradigmatic transition, a kind of a post-socialist transition. Well, most notably, China's transition has been gradual, which is a huge contrast to the Soviet Union, which took the so-called Big Bang approach, right? Rapid overnight privatization combined with instant price liberalization. Well, that resulted in a big bang indeed. The near total collapse of the country's economy and a giant orgy of looting of public assets by a handful of oligarchs. Well, perhaps we can relate this difference to the fact that Chinese and Soviet socialisms were also different. The Stalinist version of a planned economy was highly centralized, based on a kind of utopian ideal of bureaucratic omniscience. The post-Soviet U-turn was based on an equally idealized view of free markets, one could say. So in that regard, the idealized planned economy, the idealized free market, well, in one way, they are totally opposed to one another, but they are also similar insofar as both are based on a faith in a theoretical model that can and the notion that a theoretical model can be realized in the real world. China has been far more pragmatic in both its socialism and its capitalism. Mao Zedong initially adopted the Soviet model of central planning, but he soon began delegating authority to lower levels. A lot of these SOEs were managed not necessarily by the central government, but also by lower governments. And in China, too, actually, the early reformers considered quite seriously the use of shock therapy. There was a lot of debate about it, but in the end, and it came surprisingly close, but in the end, as we know, the Chinese chose a more gradual and pragmatic approach. Um, in any event, it is no accident that the commodification of land and labor have been the two major causes of protest in China. Not democracy, not political rights, not free speech, land and labor, right? Well, according to the economic historian Karl Polanyi, Europe's transformation into what he called market society was marked precisely by the commodification of labor and land, or as he put it, the commodification of humans and nature as factors of production. For Polanyi, humans and land are distinct from other communities in that they are not produced for markets. Therefore, he calls them fictitious commodities, right? Well, land is not produced at all, nor can we produce any more land than already exists. Well, humans are continually reproduced, but not with the primary purpose of satisfying labor markets. Slave labor accepted, but at least under capitalism. Let me conclude then by considering some of the contradictions of Chinese state capitalism, both at home and globally. So paradoxically, the ideological premise for these economic reforms was the party's announcement in 1978 that class struggle was over, and it was time to focus on the economy, especially the peasant, poor peasant. So it was the formal abolition of class struggle that has now led to the emergence of this massively stratified economy that includes, for the first time, a huge industrial proletariat. But precisely because class has been retired from the official lexicon, there is no adequate political vocabulary even to describe the problems today. On the contrary, labor protests are seen as a threat to harmonious society, the sort of slogan in vogue. And of course, from the global perspective, the ultimate problem with capitalism is the necessity of endless economic growth. The founding premise of capitalism is the need for continuous accumulation of capital. We can think of that as a kind of multi-generational Ponzi scheme. It is a gospel of perpetual growth that uses capital to generate surplus value, that is transformed into capital, that generates surplus value, that is transformed into capital, and so on and so forth. It's like a perpetual motion machine. Well, importantly, the Polish-German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg essentially outmarxed Marx. She argued that primitive accumulation is not just a one-time pre-capitalist event. Even mature capitalism, quote-unquote mature capitalism, can't produce surplus value out of nothing. It is not a system of alchemy. In order to reproduce itself as a system, capitalism must engage in a continual process of primitive accumulation. It always needs an unequal outside from which to draw resources. Well, in the 19th century, the chief problem of capitalism was underconsumption, according to Luxemburg, and the need for new markets provided one of the main, if not the main, motivation for imperialism. And actually, China was one of her chief examples. Well, remarkably, in 1839, China had to be coerced to enter into free trade in opium by means of war, namely the Opium War. Well, of course, over time, China in fact became much more than just a market for foreign goods. It also became a site for the expansion of capital and source of labor, as we know. Well, fast forward to 2001 and China's entry into the WTO. This time around, China waged a battle to gain admission to a global trading regime, rather than trying to stay out of it. There is no better illustration of China's economic transformation. And if the age of imperialism was sort of the first age of globalization, then the WTO symbolizes the second one. It is no less imperial than its predecessor. David Harvey calls it new imperialism, right? Which is equally determined to create new consumers, find new outlets for capital, and to provide access to cheap labor without taking political control of land, but all the other aspects are there. Well, with the new enclosure movement underway, China too is starting to run out of people and land to dispossess at home. And it is striking that Chinese capital is increasingly looking for outlets elsewhere, whether resource extraction projects in Africa or the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Well, if China too wants to find its own China to exploit, the West is hardly in a position to criticize. But given China's size, where can it possibly find another China large enough for its purposes, right? So China may be a latecomer to the party, but because of its sheer scale, its arrival will have systemic, indeed planetary consequences. The only other kind of market I can think of is India. Here, let me quote Cecil Rhodes, whom I don't quote often, but he said famously, quote, "If I could annex the planets, I would," end quote. Well, even Cecil Rhodes realized he couldn't. Contrast that with the billionaires today. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are busily planning to conquer new planets. They're ready to leave this one behind like a deflated balloon. But as the environmentalist movement says, there is no planet B. One day, the music will stop. Some generation somewhere on this planet will be left holding the bag. Let me be clear, though. I'm not saying that capitalism invented the exploitation of nature. That happened with the emergence of agriculture at the latest. Even for Marx, work signifies man's struggle against nature, turning nature into usable products. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao militarized actually that struggle. He literally declared war on nature, whether in the form of eradicating the so-called four pests that he said were stealing people's food, or seeking to domesticate China's rivers that in order to produce electricity. My point is simply that capitalism takes this struggle against nature to a new level, transforming it into a total war against nature. With the commodification of land in particular, it becomes a war against nature as such. And with the commodification of labor, a war against humans too, at least the laboring ones. But of course, one thing is certain. Our war against nature will end. We even know how it will end. Nature will win because it always does. So let me just conclude by saying that we have, and this is the global conclusion, we have no choice but to reestablish a balanced relationship to nature and also to one another, because a natural equilibrium is not possible without some reasonable equality among humans too. In that regard, neither nature nor the Chinese are the enemy economically or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that very, very interesting overview. Um, Let me now introduce our first respondent, Chitra Joshi. Chitra Joshi taught for several decades in Delhi University and had teaching assignments and fellowships in institutions in India and outside. Her publications include Lost Worlds, Indian Labor and its Forgotten Histories, which was published by Permanent Black in 2003 and Anthem in 2005. Labor in Transport, Histories from the Global South, 1750 to 1950, which was co-edited with Stefano Bellucci, El Correa, and J.G. Deutscher, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and several book chapters and essays in international journals. A founding member of the Association of Indian Labor Historians, she is currently working on a book project on labor regimes beyond the factory. So, Chitra, over to you, and you have 20 minutes for your comments.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. As I mentioned, I enjoyed reading Teemu's essay and getting to know more about the predicament of the working class in contemporary China. I was also struck by how scholars across generations and locations continue to return to Thomson's Making of the English Working Class. And, there was a time when it seemed that a shift away from social history would eclipse works like that of Thomson. But it's interesting to see how the diverse ways in which historians across the globe are rereading Thomson, building on his arguments and going beyond his framework, critiquing him from different perspectives today. There are several important arguments that Teemu develops in the paper, and my comments are based on the essay that was circulated to us. First, Teemu shows how the process of making the working class in China was radically different from the classic case of the English working class. Unlike in England, where enclosures displaced peasants and created a reserve army of labor for urban industries, in China, there was no large-scale proletarianization in the early phase of urban economic development. The process of proletarianization came much later. He develops this argument by tracking different phases of working class formation in China. The early decades after the revolution, the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution years, the post-Mao decade of the 1980s, and the subsequent period of liberalization since the 1990s. In the early years, the rights of cultivators were secured and they were tied to the land, not dispossessed. Only much later, in the time of liberalization, were they proletarianized. Even in the period of acute rural distress during the Great Leap Forward period in the late 50s, peasants remained tied to land. So unlike in England, distressed peasants were not free to migrate to cities. Peasants were, in a sense, immobilized. The huku system, which he just mentioned, categorizing population according to their place of residence, fixed peasants to their existing location. So they had no access to various welfare benefits outside their registered location. Secondly, Teemu demonstrates quite persuasively how the developmental trajectory in China was characterized by a profound structural inequity between the urban and the rural, a structural feature which was reproduced over time in many different ways. Peasants were tied to the land. Tax and grain extraction sustained urban life, but peasants could not fully gain from urban development. State policy created a clear hierarchy between the privileged urban industrial class with employment and social security for life and the rural population that was denied access to these urban privileges. So Teemu argues that the peasants who made the revolution lost out in a sense in relative terms, even though their lives improved in many different ways. So thirdly, Teemu shows how the working class that came into being with privileges and securities was unmade in the period of liberalization. And this is a point I come back to later. So the essay is thus structured around a series of binaries: pre-liberalization, post-liberalization, making of the working class, making of the peasantry, the unmaking of the working class, the unmaking of the peasantry. So the narrative derives its energy from an exploration of these complementary and conflicting processes. So I would like to make a few observations on the comparison that he draws. Firstly, on the question of proletarianization, the picture of proletarianization in England is now, being rethought. Many writings since the 1990s critique the idea of enclosures in England as marking a dramatic rupture. The process of rural displacement and proletarianization that followed was not a simple linear process. It was a process marked by interruptions, by resistance. New researches on the history of the commons show how cottagers and copyholders resisted displacement. They clung to their common rights and continued to survive till the 1880s. Many of these historians, like Neeson, for instance, question Thomson's picture of proletarianization, even though they are inspired by him. Teemu argues persuasively that in China, the history of proletarianization and enclosures takes on a radically different form. In the first phase, under Mao, the making of the working class was accompanied by the making of the peasantry. Landlords were displaced, land was given over to cultivators, and their rights confirmed. Instead of dispossession, there was a creation of a peasantry, even though peasants were severely taxed to feed the urban population. In the urban areas, workers had secure jobs, healthcare, housing, and other welfare benefits. So in the post-Mao era, during liberalization, peasants were displaced and relocated. Their lands were taken over as agribusiness reaches the countryside. Enclosures and proletarianization happen in China not in an early phase of primitive accumulation, but in a later phase of industrialization. At this time, the condition of workers in the urban areas is also radically transformed. They lose their earlier privileges, their welfare rights, as well as job security. So in Teemu's formulation, there's an unmaking of the working class along with the unmaking of the peasantry. So instead of a privileged working class, we now have a proletarianized circulating labor force moving in and out of the city, not fully dependent on urban wages for a living. So wages were inadequate, job security was absent. So, these are very important and interesting formulations, but the predicament of the Chinese workers in the period of liberalization portrayed in this account is not peculiar to China. In fact, it mirrors the condition of workers in other regions of the global south today. We see similar processes at work in India over the last few decades. Security of jobs has disappeared, wages have declined, hours of work have increased, and precarity has been normalized. So we need to perhaps specify how the changes in China are different or peculiar. So let me, just elaborate a little on this. One, on the question of partial proletarianization, a dependence of urban workers on agriculture for survival that Teemu refers to has been a characteristic feature in India for a long time. Modernization theorists writing on Indian labor in the post-independence years saw the rural connection as a sign of the absence of a committed industrial labor force. But writing since the 1980s demonstrated how the rural, in fact, remained integral to the lives of urban workers. So circulation between the rural and the urban is common in both the Chinese and the Indian case. So what is different in contemporary India is the changed nature of this circulation. In recent years, the shrinking possibilities of employment in both rural and urban areas have deepened conditions of precarity in which workers live. So I would like to ask if one can see similar trends in China today. On the meaning of precarity, I'd like to ask how relevant are terms like precarity to describe the condition of migrants flowing into cities in China. Do they constitute a part of a precarious, flexible labor force that we see in other cities of the global south today? Or do circularity and alternative forms of sustenance from the rural give migrants a possibility of bargaining for better terms? So, and today, even in countries of the industrial north, conditions have changed, and many recent writings argue that the standard employment relations that were characteristic of the north are now being rapidly eroded, and there's increasing informalization and casualization of the workforce. The second question which arises is, how do we understand the making of the working class? So, in discussing the shift between different phases in the history of working class formation in China, the essay foregrounds the role of the socialist state. Initiatives coming from the top, economic pressures, and the global context determining state policies were no doubt important. But is it possible to also get a picture from below? Beverly Silver in her 2003 book, argued how global movements of capital are also marked by the recreation of labor movements in new locations. Can we see similar processes at work in China today? How far is the collective action of migrant workers acting as a pressure on capital and the new enterprises in China? So in a later essay of 2009, Silva argued that China had become an epicenter of world labor unrest. And she underlines that the importance of these movements in defining the nature of governmentality should not be underestimated. She emphasized how concessions wrested through spontaneous actions from below are an important force in shaping state policies. So the role of the working class in shaping the condition of their existence is something Thompson underlined repeatedly. So I'd like to know, how do we look at the agency of workers in constituting themselves within the context of state socialism or state capitalism? So what are the limits and possibilities of their actions? Has the nature of their agency changed in different phases of their history? Secondly, on the question of gender and working class formation, um, in the post-revolutionary years in the 1950s and the Great Leap Forward phase, Teemu argues that the social and economic position of women was relatively better. Even though there was no complete gender equality, the tasks of social reproduction were socialized, and women could and were obliged to work outside the home. What happens to women in the post-liberalization period, in the post-1990s? Did women form part of the floating migrant labor force? Did they provide the flexible labor force for industries? Alternatively, did single male migrants constitute a dominant proportion of the migrant workforce, and women in rural areas were left to carry out the task of social reproduction? Did they also experience the precarity of employment? And if they did, it would be good to know how that affected their status and power within society. An important theme that Teemu focuses on, which is not addressed in existing studies on labor, is a transformation in the relationship between humans and nature, or the war against nature, as he calls it, especially in the phase of rapid industrialization in the period of Great Leap Forward. This war against nature led to an attempt to exterminate mosquitoes, flies, sparrows, rats, etc. So, present historical studies of industrial and colonial societies show a similar war against what were categorized as pests and vermins. So these campaigns sometimes led to the extermination of specific species of non-humans. So historians have been looking at the history of these campaigns and the politics of these categorizations. What counts as pests and what is classed as vermin. So it would be good to know how these campaigns and the ideology and politics that accompany them differed in China. How was the Chinese experience and history in this campaign against nature specifically different? On the question of class, the working class that Teemu focuses on is the urban industrial working class. I would like to know who forms a part of this urban working class that Teemu is talking about. Till some decades ago, the focus of historical writings was factory-centric. And today, this focus has changed, and we're looking at workers outside the factory, involved in different forms of labor and subjected to different kinds of labor regimes. So how do proletarianized peasants and other laboring groups outside urban industries figure in Teemu's ideas of class? So Thompson, in fact, had an extremely elastic and inclusive notion of working class. It encompassed within it a variety of groups with divergent interests: artisans, field laborers, handloom weavers, etc. The marginalized, the losers, were important to the formation of the working class that Thompson narrates. So I think his focus on the displaced and those who lost out in the process of development is helpful in making sense of the plurality of forms that characterize working class formation today. So how would these ideas resonate with the study of working class formation in China today? Where, for instance, would artisans figure in Teemu's account of proletarianization? Is artisanal industry not important within the overall economy of China? How are they to be categorized if we operate with a binary of peasant and worker? So in terms of the total contribution to GDP, their contribution may not be substantial, but local specialty industries, we know, still flourish, ceramics or embroidery or lacquerware, paper making, which has been studied by by Aforth, for instance. So many of these handicrafts are integrated to international supply chains, and they've come to symbolize Chinese cultural heritage even in the modern world. So how do we incorporate them in our analysis of the working class? How does heterogeneity define the diversity of working class experience? I know that Teemu's primary concern is not with the subjective experience of workers, as he underlines, but I'm raising this point because in Thompson's frame, the subjective and the objective are inseparably connected in the making of the working class. So thank you. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chitra. Um, we will move on, and let me introduce our second respondent, Jonathan Hyslop. So Jonathan Hyslop is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and African Studies at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. He has published widely on the social and political history of Southern Africa, on maritime history, and on British Empire history. Hislop worked for many years at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, where he was deputy director of the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research and a member of the committee of the Johannesburg History Workshop. He has been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 2007-2008 and a fellow of the Rework program at Humboldt University Berlin from 2015 to 2016. So, John, over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Zane, for this invitation. I'm very excited to be here and also to see great scholars like Prabhu Mohapatra and Rana Bahal here. I want to start by saying that Zane invited me to make a comparison with South Africa, but this is a slightly difficult comparison to make in relation to China because China, of course, is a state with thousands of years of coherence. South Africa, as a state, only formed in 1910. And throughout the 20th century and into the present, it's been largely reliant for labor on other countries of the region, notably Mozambique, Nyasaland, Malawi, and Lesotho. And it also overlaps in complicated ways with two other cross-border migrant labor systems, namely that around what was formerly Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and that of the copper belt of Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, and the Katanga, Belgium, Congo. So you're dealing with a very newly created state system with massively cross-border labor flows. So that's a very important thing to note at the beginning. Now, to a student of Southern African history, there's one paragraph in Teemu's paper that just leaps off the page. And that is his description of Chinese political economy on page 63. And I think it's worth quoting this nearly in full. The key to China's proverbial cheap labor lies in the hybrid character of its migrant workers. Urban capital extracts the ablest peasants themselves, albeit only temporarily, and they also continue to be supported by their rural villages. Migrant workers are effectively a reserve army of commodified labor that bears the costs of its own reproduction. It is these workers' ongoing reliance on the support of their rural kin that makes it possible to pay them below subsistent wages. Now, the reason why these words are so striking is that they mirror almost exactly the analysis of South Africa produced between the 1970s and 1990s by South African Marxist or Marxist scholars, both within the country and in exile. But there are two obvious major differences. Whereas Teemu is talking here about contemporary China, the analysis that the South Africans developed applied most directly to the period between the formation of the modern South African state in 1910 and around 1948, which is the beginning of the formalization of the policy of apartheid. It's a model which also applies to an earlier period to some extent and to the apartheid area to a degree, and lesser so to the present. But really, that's the era, that historical era, which when it's most similar, perhaps. Now, there's obviously something very striking about this. How do you get a similar labor system prevailing under a communist, state capitalist orientated regime with still some formal commitment to Marxist ideology and a racist, segregationist colonial state? They both produce a system which on the surface of it seems pretty similar, and I think below the surface of it at all. So that gives us a lot to think about. Now, I would say, first of all, that I found Teemu's ideas extremely fascinating because he's contrasting the Chinese system on the one hand, where you have a non-commodified rural set of relations, and the English system on the other, where you have enclosure and commodification of land. And when I applied that framework to South Africa, I thought actually the interesting thing about South Africa is that you see both things. In other words, there is a non-commodified element in the land settlement, which actually does provide the basis of migrant labor. That is a rural subsistence, to some extent, one could argue, continuing pre-colonial kind of land system. And on the other hand, you have a commodified system which where there is something very analogous to enclosure, which are the massive white-owned farms of South Africa. So in a sense, the elements of both what Teemu sees in China and of the English system. And let me try and explain this. So if you look at Southern Africa, the colonization of most of the interior is remarkably late. Obviously, the Dutch have been in the Cape Colony since the 17th century, but the vast interiors of Southern Africa are only colonized in the case of what's now South Africa, really during the 1870s and 1880s, and in the case of what's now Zimbabwe, Zambia, Congo, in really the 1890s in practical terms. So it's really quite late in the day. When the mining revolution starts in South Africa, and I won't go too much into the other regions because I don't have time, but when the mining revolution starts in the 1870s, initially there is a bit of a flow of voluntary African labor. But as that mining system expands, and particularly with the real heat of the revolution of mining in the 1890s, with the development of the Waterfront gold mines, there's real difficulty in getting enough labor. And African workers are reluctant to come forward because there is a pretty much intact traditional clan-based subsistence agriculture. So the colonial authorities have the problem of how do you get labor, and they begin to impose poll taxes. In the South African, the Rand case, they particularly call on labor from the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, where there's a lot of coercion involved. But despite these pressures, you do in fact have traditional agriculture continuing, and it's from those areas where the system runs. What you see on the mines and later factories is a pattern where workers come to the cities on limited term contracts before returning, if they survive, to their homesteads. And the mines have extremely high costs, complicated geological reasons for that. And obviously, one of the few ways in which they can keep costs down is by suppressing labor. And what makes that possible is that their families, and particularly women's labor in the rural areas, keeps subsistence agriculture going, which enables employers to pay wages which are below the cost of reproducing the families of the workers. Now, this system was initially somewhat haphazardly organized, but by the early 1920s, the South African state had developed a unitary system of so-called pass laws, under which black residents in urban areas were tied to it was tied to employment. So you could only stay in the urban areas if you had a job, and that was enforced by documents and the police checking up. And if you did not have the right document, you got deported to the rural areas. And what's fascinating about Teemu's paper in this regard is this idea of the legalized distinction between the rural and the urban. Because what the South African state does is to essentially read all African people as rural and white people as urban, right? And this is actually enforced by policing. So there's a sort of South African equivalent of that legalized distinction, which makes the system go round. And this social order prevailed to the mid-20th century. Now, where notorious apartheid policy, in my analysis, comes from, and I think the analysis of the South African scholars that I'm talking about, is that by the 1940s, there's a bit of a crisis because capital actually has a dilemma, which is, do you continue with this migrant labor system, or do you try and create a settled urbanized workforce? And there's this whole discussion, which you actually find in other parts of the British Empire as well, about the idea of stabilization. And part of the pressure for this is that although the system has worked very well for the mines in terms of exploitation, it's not at all clear it's sustainable because people who are trapped in the rural areas have decreasing capacity to support themselves. There's overcrowding, cattle disease, soil erosion, all these kinds of things. So there's an idea that maybe you should go to something that looks more like, if you like, the English system of a permanently urbanized workforce. What in fact happens is that the racial populist apartheid party comes in, and what apartheid is a sense an option to preserve the migrant labor system by force of policing. In other words, you nail it down, you keep people being pushed back to the rural areas. Of course, in the long run, it doesn't work. There are all sorts of contradictions. But whereas you'd had a fairly coherent emergence of a state between 1910 and 1950 using this labor mobilization from the rural areas. From the apartheid era, you have this forcible maintaining the system in conditions where it's breaking down. And of course, it has all sorts of interesting contradictions, which in the end helped to erode apartheid. I was very interested that Teemu talked about how Chinese workers make first-rate workers, but second-rate consumers. And there's a similar problem for the authorities in the apartheid era, which is that they're getting all this cheap labor, but on the other hand, as the economy grows, they can't sell stuff to people to keep the economic expansion going. There's a lot of engineering of upward mobility of poor whites in the apartheid era. But of course, once whites have got upward mobility and white families have got a car and a fridge and a house, there's nobody else to sell those things to, right? So the market is not big enough. And that's one of the many, many contradictions of apartheid. I also just want to say something about what happens in the white farm areas. Of course, in the colonial process, white farmers seize vast tracts of land, but those are not really where the migrant workers are coming from. In fact, white farmers were, I would say, typically land rich but capital poor. So initially, they can't really farm the farms themselves. And what they do is they essentially have a system of sharecropping. They allow African tenants to farm the land and give them a bit of the produce. And whereas a lot of popular accounts of South African history tend to say, well, you have the Great Land Division and the Native Land Act of 1913. In fact, although that had terrible displacements associated with it of rural people, by and large, the sharecroppers stay on the land much after that. And so it's only by the mid-century when you start to get mechanization of agriculture that the white farmers actually, with a lot of state support, have the capacity to farm the farms themselves and do actually then transfer their workers into status, but over many decades of agricultural laborers. So there is an analogy to the enclosure system there very strongly, although it takes quite a long time. The other thing I'd like to talk about is actually about how Thomsonian thought is taken up in South African scholarship. I think that one of the things which happens is that South African scholars are actually attracted by something a little bit different from what Teemu is talking about in Thompson. It's not so much the enclosure narrative, which you can find in other British Marxist scholars such as Dobb, but rather the complex nature of class identity and formation. What you have in Thompson, I think, is actually a process where, as he's breaking away from the British Communist Party in the 1950s, he comes to see mainstream communist thought as having had a rather prescriptive view of what working class consciousness should be. That it's a vision in which famously you're moving from Klasse an sich to Klasse für sich, okay, class in itself, a class for itself. And Thompson, in advocating for a vision of the working class which was present at its own creation, is emphasizing in a way that there's no single correct class consciousness. Rather, as English workers create themselves appropriations of religion, folk tradition, popular notions of fairness and equality, modernist, liberal, and proto-socialist thought, and they put all these things together into a kind of class consciousness. And I think the South African scholars who explored these ideas also, in a way, used it to critique ideas of coming really from the South African Communist Party, which is very influential in the liberation movement, which was a somewhat top-down approach. And this brings us back, I think, to Teemu's other theme, which is the question of the Soviet model. Because in Southern Africa, the Soviet model has quite an afterlife. So there are attempts in post-revolutionary Angola and Mozambique to actually create models of collectivization and industrialization modeled on the Soviet Union, and actually often managed by East German advisors who give a lot of very bad advice, in my view, during these times, and these projects fail. And there's also, of course, the interesting kind of historical paradox tragedy of what happens in the ANC. And generally, the traditional left critique now of the ANC is that ANC government has been neoliberal, and that this neoliberalism has led to the failure of South Africa to develop a successful trajectory. But I think you have to look instead at the kind of disorientation which was created by the fact that through the influence of the Communist Party, the ANC bought into a kind of Soviet model. And in the 1980s, at the height of the revolutionary uprising in South Africa, and I mean, I went to a lot of political meetings where this was discussed. It was very much the Soviet model which was going to be implemented. Or, I mean, not they didn't quite put it like that, but this is where the ideas were coming from. And in fact, what happens is that the ANC comes to power at exactly the moment that the Soviet Union has collapsed. That model is no longer viable. I sometimes say that, the ANC ditched the socialism but kept the authoritarianism. So you have this weird afterlife of certain Soviet ideas. Everybody calls each other comrade, etc., etc. But there's no real successful project. And in fact, although I do think the current Ramaphosa government is somewhat more coherent, has some good infrastructure projects and so on, this sort of disorientation provoked, I think, the opportunity for really state capture by a lot of corrupt elements. I think that is being fought back a bit at the moment. But there's this strange afterlife of the Soviet project and its kind of running into the sands of history in South Africa. I have so much more to say. This is such a wonderful paper. It raises such big questions. I love the broad historical approach, and of course, the New Left Review is a great venue for this. I wish we could maybe talk more about the British Marxist tradition and how that interacts. This is something that South Africans were very aware of. It's great to see this wonderful historical comparison. I like to say that the trouble with sociology today is that it's really retreated into the present, right? And it's actually the retreat into the present that's the danger, not retreat into the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Teemu, would you like to take 10 minutes to respond to what Chitra and John have said? Oh,
Well, I will try to take less because I know there are questions too, but I do
sure,
want
sure, sure.
to just thank both of you, Chitra and Jonathan, for taking the time to read the piece so carefully and for your very generous and insightful comments and questions. So you are in many ways the ideal audience for this because, like, I'm not trying to reach the China people. I really want to engage in a broader conversation, and the piece is indeed has this broad historical scope, which can land one in a lot of trouble, but I do think I hope it's trouble worth having. So let me just, Chitra, you raised a lot of different points. I may not be able to respond to all of them, either in terms of time or just maybe not at all. We don't have the capacity because they are very good questions, some of which I may not have great answers for. But let me note what you raised is, of course, the use of E.B. Thompson in my piece is more heuristic or suggestive. I mean, E.B. Thompson's tome is like 700 pages. It's deep, deep social history. I'm not a social historian. So I mean, I think I say it in the essay version, I believe in that, Thompson really is interested in exploring the emergence of working class consciousness, right? How working class becomes as a subject with a self-awareness for itself. And I am more concerned, not that that doesn't concern me, my concern is really more in kind of the emergence of the Chinese working class in an objective economic sense. And the question is, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that the Chinese working class is not present in its own creation. It certainly is. One problem is that I don't have the skills to document that. But the other issue is that what is significant for my project is that, what is the problem of the Chinese working class, as it were, which is hard to define, very hard to define, partly because the problem facing the Chinese working class is that I think they understand their predicament. They have sophisticated analysis. They have some power too. Chinese government is afraid of protests. The wages, China is no longer as cheap as it was, right? Now that it's, somewhat, the wages have gone up more. Companies are looking for even cheaper places. But the issue is for the Chinese working class is they are struggling to find a public language in which to articulate their grievances. And perhaps it because of the state-controlled nature of the media, whatever. It's not that they lack the ability, passion, politics, analysis, but partly it's sort of like the way in which the state has been good at keeping these protests separate. And there's a kind of cellular structure to these protests, and they haven't coalesced into a kind of public collective movement. So I think that's the issue. So my analysis is really more structural and analytic than Thompsonian in that deep sense. Um, well, let me say a little bit more about gender. In the essay, I don't say much about it other than sort of note that, things were at least better. There was some improvement, certainly during the Maoist period, but I don't say much about what happens after. In the book version, I talk much more about what happens to sex relations and gender equality afterwards. So ironically, with increasing liberalization, reform, marketization, a lot of the traditional gender norms come back, right? So in the countryside, when there's a return to household-based productions, when you had collectives, women were part of the workforce, they had a public presence, they were paid, and they were public actors. When there's a return to household farming, there's often a return to traditional gender norms. The women stay at home. If the men, especially the younger men, they go to the city, they go to factories, construction. The younger women in particular often also go out, but usually, the textile industry, electronics, lighter industries. And partly their desire is to get away because their fate is to get married and to bear children, right? And they are looking for adventure, whatever, which they may or may not find. But there's this desire for them to find at least temporary liberation in the city. But they often typically see it as temporary. They plan to come back and marry and have children. And so the people who are left behind, who then continue to support these outgoing migrants, they're not exclusively women, but they're more likely to be women. They like to be older people who are not as able-bodied, right? They are the support network for these outgoing migrants. So there's definitely a gendered element that I don't discuss in the essay as much, which is certainly part of the book. I guess let me then briefly address the question which is really the question, what is unique about the Chinese worker? In many ways, this is not a unique story. Capitalism, industrialization everywhere relies on primitive accumulation. Every sort of all major 20th century revolutions were essentially peasant revolutions, right? And subsequently, if the new state, post-colonial state, whatever it is, if they want to industrialize without borrowing from the West and becoming completely subservient, if they want to industrialize, they have to rely on some form of primitive accumulation that the peasants ultimately pay for, right? There's no other place to turn to unless you want capital from the outside. So I would say it's not unique that you get migrant labor. What is unique about the Chinese case, and I think this comes back to Jonathan's point as well, is in most places, ultimately, I think the migrants tend to stay in the city or become absorbed into the urban proletariat. Whereas in China, this is not just an economic process. This is a legal and state managed process, much like in South Africa, right? And and I've been thinking about this. I'm not aware of any other place other than South Africa, which has been on my mind. I'm not aware of any other place where the state was able to control this migrant labor through this legal and administrative means for so long. And even now that they are expropriating, that's also because the state has decided uh, to do so. So I think in there is a debate in the field of Chinese studies how exactly to describe the unequal relationship between city and country. There are several analytic terms. Some people describe it as a regime of internal colonialism. It is a kind of system of resource-based extraction, right? And a legally marketed, first versus second class citizenship, right, as it were. Some people say that it is a kind of caste structure, insofar as, this hukou system is based on you inherited, it's matrilineally inherited, it basically becomes, like I said, poverty becomes an inherited condition. Uh, some people refer to it as a rural-urban apartheid. Uh, I mean, none of the analogies are precise, but I think they are all instructive in their own way. Um, I've, I think what happens in South Africa, the Native Land Act in 1913, which basically creates these native reserves, and which then become migrant labor between townships. People travel between townships and cities. I think it's the only really kind of closely analogous system I can think of, but partly because I'm trying to keep it somewhat readable. My main reference are, and partly because I want to challenge dominant ideological narratives, my main reference are England and the Soviet Union, precisely whether those narratives even describe what happened accurately, but they have become the dominant narratives about transition from feudalism to capitalism, socialism to capitalism. Um, so I think, well, and let me just plug somebody else's book. There's a very good book by Mingwei Huang called Reconfiguring Racial Capitalism, South Africa in the Chinese Century, where she talks about, interestingly, how a lot of these, now that Chinese capital is going global, how a lot of these Chinese petty capitalists, as well as state capital, private capital, when they go to China, to go to South Africa, they're actually reproducing many of the labor exploitation patterns, as it were, that they themselves are fleeing from China. They actually like to rely on migrant labor from um, Mozambique or wherever from surrounding countries. So there is a way in which these practices are being uh, urban Chinese rural urban practices of exploitation. They're actually taking them with them to South Africa and then partly relying on pre-existing labor practices and their own, and they're reproducing these things. So I think that's an interesting footnote to add, sort of how globalized these phenomena are becoming. But I'm not going to say more because I think maybe we should also hear from the audience.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have time perhaps for one round of questions which all of our speakers could respond to, because it's kind of there are two very broad questions here. So a first question comes from Brian. Brian asks, how is working class protests changing as the iron rice bowl is being broken in China, or as the public sector is being privatized in other regions of the world? Do the protests of older, formerly permanent workers, younger, more precarious workers, and women differ? So that's the first kind of big question. And the second big question, which perhaps more directed to Chitra and Jonathan, is Teemu writes of state-owned enterprises in China where the state slash enterprise regulates workers' lives on and off the shop floor in terms of education, leisure, and even marital relations. Have similar enterprises existed in South Asia and Southern Africa? Um, perhaps we could go in the other order, Chitra, Jonathan, and then Teemu. Chitra, would you like to start?
Well, yes, in India we had, I mean, state-owned enterprises played a very important role, well, up to the 80s or so. But we have work by Jonathan Parry on Bhilai and other state-owned enterprises, and but I don't think the kind of privileges which the Chinese workers in the state-owned enterprises enjoyed were available in India. I mean, they did have access to education and other kinds of facilities, but not on the same scale. I think in China, it's a very different case altogether, what Teemu is talking about. And yeah.
There's a second question, Chitra, if you want to talk about that also, which is how working class protest has been changing in India since as the public sector has been privatized.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in India, like in many other countries, I mean, possibilities of protests are becoming more and more difficult, as you can see. But I mean, today, for instance, we right now we are in the context with these new labor codes have been passed, and it's very difficult for workers to protest against the new labor codes, which are going to really deny them various rights which they had earlier. But despite that, we did have today, in fact, in Delhi, there was a major protest by various unions, but we don't know whether the government is really going to, take these into account, whether it's going to respond to them. So I think the situation today is quite different, but the farmers' protest did throw, give us some hope because, the state had to hold back, had to withdraw various new laws which they were passing. And we're hoping that the same might happen with the labor codes, the kind of pressure which is coming from the unions. But of course, it's not the same kind as was possible earlier before the 80s. Yeah.
Thanks, Chitra. John?
Yeah. So, of course, one thing we have to think about is in terms of control of the working class, is that we're now in this digital age, which gives gives regimes all sorts of ways of controlling people which didn't exist before, even in the most physically brutal regimes of the past. So that really complicates questions about dissent. But there's a couple of things about working class protest in apartheid. I don't know whether Teemu would see any comparisons, but in the end, one of the striking things about apartheid was that although it was so heavily repressive, in the end, workers did manage to get leverage. And I think that leverage happened because it wasn't really possible to prevent the formation of an urban working class. People kept slipping through the system. They become more stable and settled, and you get unions rising and the state deciding by the 1970s, and the state really deciding to accommodate those unions. And that then produces an enormously successful labor movement. So that by the time the ANC comes to power in 1994, the unions have enormous political traction. And the result was that South Africa got and still has some of the most favorable labor legislation in the world for unions. And that's one of the reasons why I don't accept the simple categorization of South Africa as a neoliberal state. It really is a very labor favorable regime. However, I think the labor movement got somewhat derailed because it got on board with the project of populism of President Zuma, who actually turned out to be a horrendously corrupt leader. And that then I think produced all sorts of political fragmentation in unions, which had previously been very strong. state-owned enterprises. South Africa, the current South African state is certainly not in that business at all. It's a relatively hands-off, in some ways, state as far as trying to kind of police daily life is concerned. Where you did have things similar to that was in the collectives created by Mozambican MPLA and Mozambican Frelimo and Angolan MPLA in the 80s, but ultimately they unraveled. The last thing to say on that is that Afrikaner nationalism, though, in the South African state, the old racial South African state, was very, very heavily invested in parastatals for electricity, steel, and all these kinds of things. And those actually all exist in some form into the present, even though there have been weird partial privatizations. And South Africa is still quite a state interventionist economy. And weirdly, that there is a continuity between the sort of white Afrikaner nationalism of the past and the ANC in that.
Thanks, sir. Teemu, before you respond, is it okay? I'd just like to tack on two more questions because I think that will sort of be the last intervention of the evening.
You're in
Since
charge.
they're
You can do
directed.
whatever you want. Yes.
Okay, correct. So I'll ask these two other questions. You can respond to as much as you'd like to. So apart from what the questions that Chitra and John have dealt with, there are two questions specifically for you. The first one that I'd like to pick up is from an anonymous attendee who asks, if the Chinese Revolution of 1949 was a peasant revolution, why did workers remain relatively more privileged than peasants after it? So that's one question. And the second question is from Nena Majrekar, who says, thank you for a very interesting talk. I have two connected questions about periodization of the making of the Chinese working class. How did proletarianization in the 1950s compare with the earlier processes of proletarianization, which produced the urban proletariat involved in, for instance, the 1926 Chinese general labor strikes? And how do these earlier processes compare with the processes in early modern England, enclosures, primitive accumulation, commodification of labor, etc.? So that's a sort of a jumble of questions, and we have about three or 4 minutes. So you can take what you'd like from them.
Thank you. Well, let me first respond to those last two questions that you just raised, because they're kind of related. The reason why the workers were privileged, it was precisely because this is a Cold War. China is keen to compete. It realizes it needs heavy industry. So, which requires serious capital accumulation. So that's why the working class becomes the privileged class. The workers become the privileged class because they are at the forefront of economic development, which is now the number one priority. Peasants, even though they were ideologically, the revolution was fought as was an alliance of the workers and the peasants. The peasants still are not fully modern subjects, right? So that's partly why you have the party state, whereas the workers, at least theoretically, also have a more advanced ideological consciousness. And let me then, I guess, respond to the question about labor protests. How is working class protests changing as the iron rice bowl is being broken? C.K. Lee has a very interesting book. She's a sociologist at UCLA called, I think it's called Against the Law, where she talks about sort of kind of regional and generational differences in these protests. So China doesn't even necessarily have a single unified political economy. So she talks about the Rust Belt area in the Northeast, which was the heartland of these big industrial state-owned enterprises. When they were privatized, people were laid off. There was a lot of protest. The language of those protests tended to be, sort of evoke ideas that communism, this is what the state owned, iron rice bowl, the social contract has been broken, that kind of language. Although even then, partly because of this kind of self-contained structure of the state-owned entities, each of these entities, they were very cellular. So even though were protests, they tended to remain cellular. It was hard for these people to connect because they had always been in kind of their separate silos. Then, insofar as you have then, in contrast, the new development in the southeast regions, right, of all these boom towns, there you had, which is the highest concentration of migrant laborers. When they get laid off and things happen, or then unhappy with their working conditions, they are less likely to protest. First of all, they're more precarious, right? And they don't have a sense of having lost something because they never had anything. They can't appeal to the language of, you've taken us what was ours, right? In the north they said we own the factory. So they if they are more likely to say, we've illegally fired, but it is difficult for them, of course, to get access to there are some public interest lawyers or whatever, but they're more like, at least they're more likely to invoke the language of law rather than political language of, this is what the revolution owes to us. But there's also huge generational differences. The older people who remember, perhaps nostalgically, the good old days when everybody was taken care of, versus the young people, because this all has taken place in an incredibly short time. They're the younger people who have known nothing but markets, and they have a very different attitude, a different relationship to work and to politics, I would say. But I realize we're running out of time, so I'm gonna, I guess, let me pause on a happier note. So all of this is very bleak. But of course, what is different about the Chinese state, let's say, compared, there are many neoliberal aspects in what the state is doing, but the state still an authoritarian and very powerful state, right? So there is an economic logic that puts pressure on a lot of things, but it's still also a party state. So there is also political logic. So the state can also, if it feels that the protest pressure is becoming too great, if it feels that the working class can no longer be contained, they can also take steps, at least to ameliorate. They have. I'm not saying that this story has been told in China. We don't know what is going to happen and how the state is going to respond. But it's not just the working class. It is the state we don't know how the state may or may not respond depending on how things develop, and that's I suppose a big political unknown. So let me pause on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's only left to me now to thank Teemu, Chitra, and John for a wonderfully productive seminar. Thank you so much for your time.